Now, this particular song is dedicated to the proposition. That's right. No, wait a minute, not that proposition. We're going to talk about green power. Green power. Money. And money. Now, the words of this song are a little interesting, so kind of spin your ear a little bit. There's a little message to be heard in the song. There's some lyrics to it that I know you're going to understand.
Hello, this is episode 38 of the For All That podcast, and this week we're joined by Ivan McKee from Business for Scotland. How's it going, Ivan?
Very good, Michael.
Good, and we're also joined by Juliet Swann, who's coming back for the second time. How's it going, Juliet?
I'm good. I could be warmer, but I'm good.
Okay, and Andrew, how's it going?
I'm splendid. I'm very warm and cheery as I look out in the cold, frosted glass of Glasgow. So it's all very nice and deeply Christmassy here.
Well, I would have been cold, but digging is warm work, and that's what I was doing this morning. And one of the things I've been digging about, apart from holes for dead cats, is the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who had a report out that was highly critical of the prospects for an independent Scotland. But a lot of people have been highlighting some serious problems with the report, and I think I'll go to Ivan first. How did you feel about the report?
Well, to be fair, I'm not really surprised. I mean, to put it in context, that's the third report the IFS have had out in just over 2 months. And basically this one said some very, very similar stuff to the previous two, which had been through in a bit of detail and significantly debunked. And then just for fun, it added on a 50-year forecast on the back of it to make us even more scared. So there's a lot of technical reasons why what they come out with really doesn't hold water. And if you want, I can go through and unpick that for you.
Yeah, please do.
I mean, if you look at what they've done, the first part that was very interesting was that they looked at the facts in terms of what has actually happened in the Scottish economy versus the UK economy over the last few years. They quoted the GERS 2011-12 numbers, which actually saw Scotland's economy much stronger than the UK average, generating £1,700 more in tax per head, lower debt to GDP ratio, etc., etc. But all of that conveniently didn't get quoted at all. The bit that got quoted was the bit where they got the crystal ball out and started looking at what was happening going forward. And the first thing they did was they took the OBR forecast for the UK economy and the oil price going forward over the next 4 or 5 years. And the problem with OBR, as anybody that watches this will know, is that they're very good at over forecasting the performance of the UK economy. That's why we always hear we've had to downgrade the growth forecast, because the OBR's got its numbers wrong again and they're too optimistic on what's happening to the UK. And they're also atrociously poor at forecasting oil price. They consistently under forecast oil price. There's a nice wee graph we've got which shows 6 forecasts for oil price, 5 of them going up, and the OBR the only one that's going down. And interestingly, one of the 5 that's going up is the UK government's on the Department for Energy and Climate Change. So for UK government's own forecast, and they use the DEC numbers, but when they want to scare the jocks, they use the OBR number. So that was all kind of lined up for IFS to build their numbers on top of. In the longer term period, what they did in forecasting the economy 50 years out is pretty ridiculous if you think about it. But to get some numbers to feed into their model, what they did was took effectively population forecasts and then a forecast on when the oil was going to run out. So the key point about that, of course, is that in terms of the population, Scotland's population is declining, the brain drain, etc. That obviously is a function of the union. The whole point about independence is to reverse that. But what the IFS based their forecast on was a Scottish population going up 4% over the next 50 years and the UK population going up 28%. So I think you look at that and say, well, that's not right. When they kind of tweaked the number to say, well, the Scottish population might go up a wee bit more than that, what the numbers actually came out and said was that Scotland's debt to GDP ratio in that scenario is actually better than the UK's right through to 2047. And then we think the oil's going to run out thing kicks in. So even when making some modest adjustments to that, then the Scottish economy didn't actually look too bad in that longer term horizon. But of course, all that happens is the media's lined up, ready to pluck out the 2 or 3 sound bites and throw them out there to create maximum impact. So in terms of a political media management exercise, it's been lined up quite cutely. The OBR has done their usual job. The IFS have just taken those numbers and crunched them through a big spreadsheet, and the media has been sitting there waiting for the sound bites to throw them out into the public domain. So yes, I mean, that's kind of, I think the more interesting part of it is the politics and how they manage the media and the effect of which the Better Together, particularly the Labour Party spin doctors, are still able to control that media message. To my mind, that's much more interesting than the economics of it, which are at best crystal ball and at worst verging on the dishonest.
And Juliet, what did you feel about the politics of it that Ivan's talking about there?
I guess, yes, so I was in London and I was also on holiday, so I wasn't paying a huge amount of attention to the media. But my essential problem is basically I've never been very good with maths. So as soon as any economists start saying anything, my brain tends to go into meltdown. And I just and it also does seem to me that it's a little bit like a lawyer. If you find an economist who doesn't say the thing that you want them to, you just try and find another one because they'll say what you do want to hear. I do think politically, though, there's something about that London-based research will always have that element of sort of fear and hatred of the nationalists in Scotland and what they might be able to do with more powers. So there is that weird underlying vindictiveness that I've sort of learnt to ignore, but I suppose lots of people don't.
And Andrew, I took a little look at who the IFS actually are, and it seems that they were founded by a Liberal Democrat peer, they're funded by a Labour peer, they've got Tory MPs as members, their corporate members include Shell, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the Department of Work and Pensions, the Department of Education and the Bank of England. Why do you think an organisation like that might be hostile to Scottish independence?
That's not a fair question, Michael.
No, it isn't,
right.
But it's not a fair report.
It's not. Yeah, I mean, I think it was really interesting to hear what Ivan was saying there, because, like Juliet, I am not an economist. I am somewhat hostile, I suppose, to foregrounding and fixating on economic analysis in our politics. I think it's really important. Obviously, I'm not saying it's jobs and wealth and whatever is critical to our politics too, but it's interesting to think how bad we are at evaluating these kind of reports, because as Ivan said, they rely on certain assumptions and they build models based on those assumptions. That's kind of at the heart of this kind of economic analysis. And in order to understand them properly, in order to scrutinize and treat them critically, as opposed to just saying, oh, this magic group of economists have spoken on behalf of the gods and they tell us that an independent Scotland is jiggered, you really have to pry into those presumptions, and often they can be very problematic. And this happens in microeconomics and in terms of social analysis. You think that they rely on assumptions which are at the very least problematic, and in some cases, sort of demonstrably false. But I think we're not very good at evaluating that, either in the press or, to be honest, as ordinary punters. I don't find myself feeling very sort of powerful and confident in terms of an economic analysis and saying that the IFS is ways off or whatever. So I think there's a competency problem here, that the message most people will take from it is one which will either be conducive to their politics, i.e. if you're a Better Together supporter, you think, well, I always knew that an independent Scotland would be buggered, now I know for sure. Or like yourself, Michael, who's maybe a wee bit more sympathetic to the independence project, you kind of look at it and you think, well, look at these economic characters and look at their pals, and I don't think I'm going to believe them anyway. So I don't know how much further forward this takes us really in the debate.
But I think that part of the role of the media should be to explain where they're getting their information from, and I think there's a weakness there. It's not often done. Certain information from certain kinds of group is presented as neutral, and then when it comes from, to take an example, when the information comes from a group like Greenpeace, it's not presented as neutral. Say a Greenpeace report, but then other groups, it's reported as this is completely neutral and value-free information. And I think it's a media failing. I mean, if I can, in an internet search in 15 minutes, if I can find out all those things that I said about them earlier, shouldn't they be doing that on the news? I'll go to Juliet with that.
I think this is part of the ongoing problem that we have broadly across the UK and indeed Western world, that the media hasn't managed to keep up with the 21st century and the way that we use and receive media anymore. So it's just the money isn't there and the expertise isn't there. So journalists don't have the time or maybe the inclination to do the research that, as you say, rightly point out, doesn't take a long amount of time, but does require a little bit of imagination and a little bit of editorial support. For me, it's a massive issue that the media is not holding democracy to account in the way that it ought to in a functioning civilized society. But how you fix that without, publicly funded media, but then look at the BBC, they're not particularly useful. So, that's a really big question. If I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be quite rich.
Okay, well, if I can narrow it down a bit, I'll go to Ivan with this, because you'd said that, sort of Labour spin doctors controlling this story. How would you have preferred to have seen it covered?
Well, if they'd actually taken the time to look at the numbers, the first headline would have been IFS verifies what the Scottish Government have been saying about the Scottish economy up to now. Over the last 30 years, it's been significantly stronger than the UK economy. That would have been a nice first headline. Second headline would have been the IFS brackets. This particular piece of research was funded by the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, which of course is funded by Vince Cable's business department. So that kind of would have been interesting to know, get that out in the public domain, who was actually funding this. And then I've gone through and unpicked it and said, well, there's it's made on these numbers, it comes out with this result, but you know what, if you put different numbers in there, you get a different result. So, it could have been presented much, much more fairly. I think the media points that Juliet's making are important. In the UK context, of course, you've got a kind of balance, because you've got some papers that are pro-Labour, some that are pro-Tory, etc., etc. So you've always got that kind of give and take. There's two versions out there, and you can kind of pick and choose what you want. The big problem we've really got in the independence debate, obviously, is that 95% of the media is effectively on the no side, which makes things much more difficult. Now, one of the very heartening things, I think, has been the online community, who within a day or two, there's a lot of clever people on there who are ripping through this and putting some very interesting different perspectives on it, and together managed to build up a fairly comprehensive debunk of it just by knocking things about online forums. And anybody that went and looked there would see all that stuff. Business for Scotland's got some great articles on it, as have many other forums out there. So that is a kind of counter, but the problem, as we know, is that isn't strong enough, or as strong as the mainstream media and where it is at the moment.
Yeah. And something you mentioned earlier, Ivan, brings us kind of nicely onto our second topic in relation to this, because, making predictions 50 years into the future could be considered a sort of absurd venture. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And Andrew, I believe in the wider context of the debate, this is something that's been annoying you recently.
Oh yeah, I've been a sort of little tower of fury over this recently. I think it's a really difficult one for Yes Scotland, for the SNP to navigate, because people out there, ordinary punters without any particular agenda and without any sort of committed sensibilities, are asking questions, but some of the questions that they're asking simply cannot be answered. That's the honest to goodness truth, that they rely on so many contingent factors. So I think this is going to become a really big, difficult tightrope for the SNP to walk on this white paper, which is being published next week. To what extent do they make confident claims about what an independent Scotland would be like? To what extent do they get out their crystal ball of their own and make their own predictions? And to what extent do they hold back a bit from that and underline the extent to which uncertainty is always an inevitable feature in human affairs, whether or not you're in the Union or whether or not you're considering leaving it? And I think thus far, at least in terms of the politics of this framing, Better Together are winning hands down. They've been able to present an image of UK stability set against abject uncertainty on a whole raft of issues with independence. And I don't think, yes, Scotland have found the way, and I don't think the SNP have found the way yet to push back and to emphasise sufficiently the extent to which the Union has its uncertainties, that everything has its uncertainties, and that they are incorrigible. And we have to make best judgments on the evidence which is before us. And there aren't guarantees. And to ask for guarantees where guarantees don't exist is frankly to indulge fantasies. And I think there is some evidence in the past around, for example, the EU